Hi, I'm Michelle Bivens. I'll be your host today for this ATD-OC podcast. This brief podcast will introduce you to our upcoming workshop, Improving Your Virtual Instructor-Led Training, or VILT, Delivery. And the working title for this podcast is, What the Heck is Confusing About VILT? You're going to find out today. Well, hopefully we'll clear some things up. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our facilitators for the workshop and our guest for today's podcast. Lynn Nissen has been facilitating training for over 20 years and facilitating virtual training for more than 10 years, which makes her the right person to provide knowledge around VILT. Anthony Harmitz is a training consultant with over 20 years of training experience from soup to nuts. What a great duo. I would like to start by asking the question, why do we have an acronym for VILT? Lynn, would you like to take that one?
Sure, I'd love to take that one. In some ways, it's a little ridiculous to me that we do have an acronym for VILT. If you think about instructor-led training and the various transitions that have happened in the past when we've switched to new types of technology. So, think back to chalkboards, right? And then flip chart paper, and then dry erase boards, and then overhead projection units. Did we make a new acronym for any of those changes? No, we did not. So why did we need one for VILT? Well, okay, so the technology is a little different, maybe more than a little different. And it really, from a learner experience standpoint, right, they're not in the same room with us anymore. So part of me says, we should just call it ILT in a virtual platform. And then I was like, yeah, okay, no, I get it. Maybe we should call it VILT. Anthony, what do you think?
I think that that's all quite accurate. I think that if I were going to add anything, the only guess that I might have is that perhaps someone wanted to differentiate VILT from webinars. And maybe when there started to be a lot more VILT going on, there was maybe a concern on somebody's point of view that there were people out there that didn't have a very high opinion of webinars. And so they thought, let's elevate the title.
They certainly are different, right? And so it is great to be able to talk a little bit about that today. So, Anthony, is VILT e-learning?
I guess that if you're going to define e-learning as any learning that's delivered virtually, then yes, VILT is e-learning. But typically, when I hear people talk about e-learning, they're usually talking about asynchronous courses, that have been designed and developed on something like Storyline or Camtasia or Captivate. Lynn, what do you think?
Yeah, so every list of various e-learning training techniques that I've seen has included VILT, but I always find it a little surprising to see it there because as the person leading the training session, the skill set that you need to have is much more similar to ILT than it is to what you would need to create an e-learning course. So while I understand that it does get put on that list pretty frequently, I think it's an important distinction for people who lead VILT sessions to know that really the skill set is much more similar to ILT than other types of e-learning.
Very good. And that does make complete sense. Thank you, Lynn. So is a webinar then VILT, and is VILT a webinar? Are they the same? Lynn, what do you think?
Is a webinar VILT is the first half of that question, right? And I would say that if you break it down, virtual instructor-led training, does a webinar give you training? And in the same way that a presentation would give you training, a webinar gives you training, because a webinar for the most part is just a presentation, lots of times only with a slide deck. You can't even see the person who's talking to you. And if you're lucky, at the end of the webinar, you get to ask a question in the chat box that someone else then reads to the presenter. So there's not a lot of two-way communication that's happening there. The flip side of that question then is VILT a webinar? And that's the piece where I would say absolutely not. I think that VILT is just like in person, it's an interactive learning environment where there's a lot of interaction between the person leading the session and the participants. You have discussions, you have activities, you have a variety of things that you're doing together and exploring the content in a very conversational back and forth method. So in that regard, VILT is probably the farthest thing from a webinar that I can think of. Anthony, what did I miss?
I think that what you said is basically correct. I do think that webinars can be at least a little bit interactive. And so, as with so many things in life, this may not be exactly a yes or no question. This may be one of those dimmer questions where somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, there's a dividing line where something stops being a webinar and starts being VILT. But I don't know that we need to split hairs and necessarily figure out exactly where that line is.
I think that's a great point.
I agree. I think it's a little smattering of each, and I have attended webinars where they are more like training and some webinars where they really are more like presentations. So let's think that through then, Anthony. We know we've talked a little bit about it being similar to a webinar. Can anyone then with a computer lead VILT?
Well, I guess again, the technical answer might be, maybe, but it may not go very well if you don't have a computer that works very well, or a system that works very well, or a sound connection that works very well. Technically, VILT, virtual instructor-led training, might be telephone training. I could get on a conference call with you and lead a training session. So maybe you don't even need a computer to do VILT. But the way that most of us are using the term now, I think you need a computer.
So then what would you need? If a computer is something, if you could do the training via telephone, what skill set would the person have to have in order to create a good, solid VILT program?
Right. So again, there's instructional design that would be involved, as with any training. And I think you'd want to make it interactive, and you'd want to have activities, and you could have practice. And so I think that you can definitely just use all your ILT skills and lead a session over the telephone. Lynn, talking about the more specific requirements that you might recommend someone to have, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of a threshold, right? There's a minimally, could I lead a session on VILT? And then there's another threshold, which is, do I sound good? Do I look good? Can the people who are my participants really learn from me easily without having to struggle to understand what I say? And are they able to connect with me because they can see my facial expressions and what I'm doing with my body language? So I would recommend a great internet connection. That would be step number one. Step number two would be a computer with a good processing speed, because that's going to really help your video and your audio. And then I would say a good quality camera and microphone. Those are the additional pieces that I think are very, very helpful.
Excellent. And of course, as Anthony had mentioned, some good design. We have to, make sure that we have our instructional design pieces in the training, and someone that can engage and teach adult learners, I guess, the content, right? Well, what about thinking about instructor-led training, which of course, those are the things that we would want in a good instructor-led training course as well. How is VILT different from in-person instructor-led training?
So I think that they're really very similar, at least at a high level. You're doing the same things in instructor-led training as you are in virtual instructor-led training. You're engaging the audience, you're asking questions, you're conducting activities, you have objectives. And I think that at a tactical level, there are some differences, though. You're using different tools and a different platform in order to do all of those things.
Absolutely. Lynn, what about you? What are your thoughts?
The only things that I would add to what Anthony said is that the focus to me of VILT initially for the person leading the session is getting confident and comfortable using the meeting platform, using that virtual tool. But as soon as you have mastered that, as soon as you have that comfort level, your entire focus goes back to being exactly what it was when you're in an ILT session. It's, are my learners learning at the pace of information that I'm giving it to them? Is everybody engaged and interactive? Have I lost anyone? Am I not being clear with my directions? How am I going to balance the participation, right? So all of the things that ILT instructors think about are the same things that VILT instructors think about after they've layered in that piece of learning to really understand their meeting platform.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so our last question is, what do we think about the future? Will VILT be substantially different? Lynn, why don't you take a stab first?
Yeah, I think I've read about some interesting advances and changes that may be coming to some of the virtual platforms that will allow for more integration with augmented reality and simulations. And I think that those things could be very interesting and engaging and maybe allow us a new range of ways of interacting that we haven't had before. But I think, like with a lot of other technology, people really need to see a practical use for it, and they also need to have time to get used to it. So I think there is not anything that I know of that's necessarily pushing us, like a pandemic, to get super comfortable with those tools. So it may be a little more gradual as a rate of change.
Yes, I think as we look back, the rate of change was definitely quite speedy. Anthony, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the change that we're going through right now and have been over the last several years from ILT to VILT is similar to the change that the movie industry went through when it went from silent films to sound films. When it got to sound films, what happened was that the writers and directors were trying to take everything they knew about writing plays and then transfer the plays to movies. And so what you got were filmed plays that used outdoor locations and different technology, but there was this issue of translation that I think was going on. And right now, I think what we're trying to do is to translate from instructor-led courses to virtual instructor-led courses. And I think some people are doing a fantastic job with that. And I think there's more to be done there, and that we'll only get better and better. But sooner or later, just as movies in the 60s and 70s and 80s started changing to be really, really different from plays, sooner or later, as Lynn said, maybe using virtual reality tools. I mean, that's one thing we can think of, but likely using all sorts of tools that haven't even been invented yet. It's going to be really different. And it'll be exciting to see it when we get there.
I love the picture that you paint, Anthony. Thank you. I'm looking forward to that, I have to say. I think that will really change how we view virtual instructor-led training. So that is the end of our podcast today. I'd really like to thank Lynn and Anthony for joining us on podcast ATD-OC. And please sign up for their workshop so that you can learn more about how to create a better environment with your virtual instructor-led training in the future.
Thanks so much for having us, Michelle.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you.